What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian.
And we're here with a very special guest. We're here with YouTuber, reporter, author, political analyst, and communist Caleb Maupin. Welcome, Caleb.
Glad to be here.
So,
Welcome.
There's been a lot of drama of your account and the BreadTube world, and I kind of wanted to discuss some of that and what's going on.
Sure.
I wasn't following this controversy particularly closely. Apparently, Vaush really doesn't like you or something.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little corner of the internet that's like not really relevant, but a lot of people that are interested in socialist and communist politics unfortunately go there. But it's inhabited by a lot of people who play video games and a lot of people that are teenagers and are, quite disconnected from actual organizing. And, there's kind of a circular firing squad where they all kind of take turns attacking each other. I think that's a big part of what goes on there. I understand like two of the people attacking me now used to be enemies and did videos attacking each other, and then they became friends. And it's this kind of like internet culture, and it's part of this weird, strange world. It's not the first time I've been at the center of kind of like, getting attacked like this on social media. After I debated two neo-Nazis, they all started attacking me as well. And so for like 2 or 3 days, my social media was just overwhelmed by neo-Nazis attacking me. What's interesting is they both have one similar complaint about me, which is that I wear a suit and tie. They're both deeply offended by that. And I wonder what that's about. What is like, is this the potential for like left-right unity among like the left internet sphere and the right-wing internet sphere, both disconnected from any actual organizing, but they both hate suits and ties. That seems to be a common theme. So yeah, I'm a communist. For me, one of the most meaningful moments of my political life was when I went to Ecuador for the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013. And I got to meet communists from Ecuador, from Vietnam, from Cuba, from North Korea, from India, from Sri Lanka, from, Southern African countries. I realized that the communists I was talking to in those other countries were a completely different breed than leftists in the United States. And I was quite frustrated with leftists in the United States. I had organized in Cleveland for a long time. I had moved to New York. I had been part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I was always frustrated. And it seemed like among communists in the United States, you had two choices. On the one hand, you had this milieu of people that just were Democrats, basically, and they went and campaigned for Democrats. And they kept up with whatever the Democrats were doing. And then once a year, they went to a meeting and they read some Marx and gave a fist salute. And that's what keeps me going, brother, or something. But then they just kind of were regular Democrats. Or if you didn't like that milieu, which I was never particularly fond of that milieu, there was this other milieu of people that, were having rallies in the streets, burning the American flag, newspapers about Trotsky, lots of newspapers selling. That's a big thing. Little tiny groups that break away from other little tiny groups and have polemics against them. And it's this milieu of people that are kind of disconnected from everything. And I was very frustrated with that. And it seemed like socialism was becoming more and more popular. Right, all the polls were showing, especially after the financial crisis, socialism was becoming more and more popular. But all these little tiny communist groups were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, I went to Ecuador for the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I discovered communists of a totally different breed. Communists that had millions of people in their organizations, had seats in parliament, and they were neither of these two groups. They weren't complete reformists, on the one hand. They hadn't abandoned what they believed in, but they also were not crazy and disconnected from society. They led mass organizations, and they kept asking me over and over again, every different group I would meet with from every different country, I would have these bilateral meetings, we called it, and they would say, what's wrong with American communists? What's wrong with American communists? Why do you guys seem to just not get it, And so I came back to the United States, and, the more and more as things developed, it became clear to me that the mainstream left continued to move in this kind of dead-end direction. I needed to move in another direction, and I knew I was going to get flack for that. For a while, I was working with a student youth group called Students and Youth for a New America, and yes, we waved an American flag. immediately people said that was proof we were Nazis because that's the flag of the empire and all of that. And I would show them pictures of Dr. Martin Luther King with an American flag, Bernie Sanders with an American flag. That meant nothing. And it seems like the more that I move into this milieu where I'm actually engaging with countries around the world that are building socialism, where I'm actually trying to reach average Americans who are upset about their incomes and the situation in the country and the decline of living standards and the rising police state, the more you move in there, the more that this kind of strange group of people that are angry at society and the world and pounding on their keyboards all day because someone's wrong on the internet, the more they become angry with you. So I'm not really that concerned about it. Vaush isn't my biggest fan. There's another guy, it's like Rotten Empanada or something, I think is his name. Rotten Empanada, something like that. And there's another guy who calls himself Thought Slime. He doesn't particularly like me either. And these people have very well put together YouTube channels with a lot of views, but I don't know how many people they actually influence who actually get anything really done in the real world. So that's where I'm at. Thanks for asking.
Well, it's fascinating to hear. I'm a New Zealander originally and was a bit of a newspaper selling trot in my youth. Gave all that up, thankfully. It's interesting to me that sort of seeing the development of a motivated socialist left in the United States. The US is such an enormous country and has such a robust market capitalist system that one can kind of build a career doing this. And I kind of wonder if some of these YouTube channels would become brands and things like that, or perhaps a sort of professional activist class who are on the way to the top. You've really taken a very different path from all that. This is not you're not really taking the path of least resistance to get paid for doing this stuff, are you?
Well, no. I see myself as coming from a tradition. The American that I most admire in U.S. history would be William Z. Foster, who was the leader of the Communist Party for many years. I studied his work, his history of the Three Internationals, towards Soviet America, his history of the Communist Party, his history of the World Trade Union movement. And he was a dynamic organizer who sought to organize real Americans to fight against injustice. It wasn't about organizing urban intellectual elites, but rather about mobilizing all of society. It was about fighting racism, because racism is probably the most deadly tool in the hands of the bosses in this country. And especially we've seen that in the more recent decades where they've racialized economic questions, right? Where it's, people who wouldn't be in favor of cutting food stamps, if they think that all the recipients of food stamps are of another race, then they're okay with it all of a sudden, right? And that because of racism, that lack of solidarity has been a big problem in the United States. And I come out of a different milieu, and I'm not trying to, if I were just trying to say things that would make me popular, I would talk very differently, I guess. No question about it.
Yeah, it reminds me, just as you mentioned, the sort of the history of the Communist Party and these sort of new accusations of class reductionism or whatever. I remember reading Jessica Mitford's book about her time in the Communist Party quite recently, and just the amount of time and effort that the Communist Party in the 40s and 50s was really putting into really cutting-edge anti-racist causes, like the Civil Rights Congress and things like that. And this was considered the work of the party, right?
Well, indeed. I mean, no organization raised the race issue more than the Communist Party did. And in fact, during the 1930s, they really stood alone, and they ran James W. Ford, an African-American man, as their vice presidential candidate. Their position on the black question was that it was a forefront question in the United States, but they also supported black nationalism. They viewed black people as a nation, as a colonized people within U.S. borders, that if they chose, would have the right to separate. Now, they didn't advocate separation. I know some people say that's what they advocated. They always said if the black people in the majority black areas of the South wanted to secede from the United States and have an independent black republic, the Communist Party would recognize that as their right. But they never called for separation. In fact, the major slogan they used was black and white unite and fight. They were for a united working class, but they recognized, like any colonized people, African Americans in the United States would have that right, to separate as a nation. And they inspired the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam very much, took inspiration from that. And that Malcolm X and a lot of the black revolutionaries of later decades who really did see black people as a nation, coming out of Marcus Garvey and all of that, saw the Communist Party as a group that was on their side. It's really fascinating. You talk about we charge genocide. which was a petition taken to the United Nations by the Communist Party and the Civil Rights Congress. And the Soviet Union arranged for the United Nations to basically have hearings about Jim Crow and the horrors of segregation in the United States. And when I was debating about this with this Vosh character, his routine is to claim that if you are a defender of the Soviet Union, if you're a defender of China, you're the same as Nazis who defend Adolf Hitler. And I pointed out that communists in this country have been on the vanguard of anti-racist struggles. And it was like, no comprendo, that doesn't count, changing the conversation. And that's kind of how these characters do it. But this is a long-standing pattern. The Congress for Cultural Freedom program was launched by the CIA in the 1950s, really in 1949. And one of the main things that all these CIA-funded writers that were associated with Partisan Review and other publications covertly supported by the U.S. government, one of the main themes was to equate communism with fascism. And in the process of doing that, they kind of also reinvented leftist politics. Like Hannah Arendt, she wrote this book about totalitarianism, repeating that line. She hung out with the Trotskyites. She was published in Partisan Review. But what was interesting about Hannah Arendt was that, she later wrote this book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was about the execution of the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. And if you read her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, her critique of Eichmann is she's writing about him and saying she writes about the banality of evil. And if you really get to the essence of what Hannah Arendt is saying, she's saying, deep down, all ordinary people have the potential to be Nazis. So they need to be controlled. They're very dangerous. And there is this elite group of intellectuals who are safe. And both communism and fascism are an expression of the masses, the rabble, these inferior, unintellectual people getting together and organizing and running society. And that's what we have to stop. And that kind of thinking, that elitism that views the masses of people as rabble, as dangerous, as hateful, ignorant mobs that need to be controlled by the enlightened intellectuals, that is how a lot of leftists view things. Leftism isn't populism anymore. Populism is almost a curse word in left-wing circles. If you're for the people and their rights, if you're trying to mobilize them to seize control of the means of production, you're just the same as the Nazis, apparently, according to these people, which nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, there was nothing socialist about the Nazi regime at all. I mean, it was very much a market capitalist system with a very heavy police state apparatus. So, but that's kind of the situation we're in, and we're struggling to save the soul of leftism.
Yeah, you talk a lot about the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which I've never heard of before until coming across your YouTube channel. I guess, how far did this organization have in actually influencing leftist politics? What did they actually all do?
Well, it's interesting. If you Google Congress for Cultural Freedom, the first thing that will come up will be CIA.gov. They brag about it. They consider it to be one of their most successful programs. It sounds like a wild conspiracy theory. When you first say it, people say, oh, great. Yeah, the tankies. Everyone who doesn't agree with them is CIA. Yeah, we heard that before. But look into the program. It was set up. The director of it was Irving Kristol. Now, Irving Kristol, after that, he later went on to become the father of neoconservatism. But, during the Second World War, he was a Trotskyist. He was associated with Max Shachtman and the Trotskyists who broke relations with Trotsky when Trotsky said the Soviet Union was still a deformed workers' state. After the 1939 pact, there were a number of Trotskyites who said, well, the Soviet Union is state capitalist. It's not socialist. They followed Max Shachtman. They broke away. So Irving Kristol had been with them. And after World War II, Irving Kristol ends up being the director of this CIA program to covertly fund leftist material. And, it ends up hiring a lot of these Shachtmanites, followers of the Trotskyite Max Shachtman. They end up being associated with it. For example, Irving Howe, who was one of the intellectuals who was key in setting up Democratic Socialists of America. Irving Howe. He was also funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, published in Partisan Review, had his work circulated at there. But it went in. This program was international. They had a publication in Germany, for example, that really pushed the work of Theodor Adorno. And it's pretty clear that a lot of American and British intelligence funding went into his research, where he developed that study of the authoritarian personality. That is very influential in how leftists think. If you go into leftist academia, you're going to read Adorno, and you're going to read about this authoritarian personality. And what is this authoritarian personality? The authoritarian personality is somebody somebody who doesn't like ambiguity, who likes there to be clear rules and reality. It's people who like certain types of music. It's people that get excited by certain things. I mean, if you're not a very, pointy-headed, shades of gray kind of individual, no matter what your political views are, you have a problematic psychology. You have a personality that makes you a fascist. And if you look at this authoritarian personality theory, almost everyone on the planet has an authoritarian personality, really, when it gets down to it. So it's this struggle to change the way people's minds work so they stop having these authoritarian personalities that demand clear answers about right and wrong. That's all coming out of CIA research. I mean, one of the people who worked very closely with Adorno to conduct that study was somebody from Britain who had worked with MI6 during the Second World War. And, Adorno was later working with the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And all of this, it was originally about separating intellectuals and artists from communism. It was about creating a barrier between them and the Soviet Union. But by the 1980s, by the 1990s, and especially today, it has taken on a completely different character. This is the complete rewriting of what it means to be a socialist. Go back and read William Z. Foster. Go back and read, there's a great pamphlet by Moishe Olgin called Why Communism? Plain Talk on Vital Problems. Read that literature. That's what it used to mean to be a communist, right? It was about the working people fighting for justice, making sure people had what they needed. It was about getting rid of the billionaires and the bankers that have been wrecking the country and driving people into poverty. That's what it used to mean to be a leftist. Now, I'm not sure what it is. It's about individualism. It's about self-expression. It's about accusing people of being racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic and tearing them down. It's about a lot of things, but it's not about that anymore. And that's very scary to me because that then hands that populism over to the right wing, which I view as very, very dangerous.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the DSA in there in terms of their they provide a convenient sort of outlet for a lot of this energy of people who are well-intended and enthusiastic about reforming society. But one thing, people just often don't realize, DSA explicitly forbids Leninists to join. If you're under the influence of a Democratic Centralist org. But if you're, literally a member of Congress for the Democratic Party, you're welcome. Is that not pretty weird?
Yeah, the thing is, I don't want to condemn all of DSA outright. My understanding is you can't be a member of a Leninist organization, but if you have Leninist beliefs, that's tolerated. The thing is, there's a lot of people at the top of DSA that have some very shady ties. I don't want to name names, but people can start Googling some of the big names and their history. And we all know that. But I actually would encourage, as a journalist, I can't be a member of any political organization. I'm in the process of trying to build a think tank, but I can't be a member of any political party or anything like that. But if you're a young person and you're getting into socialism and communism, I would encourage you to join the DSA, but just know what you're dealing with. Realize that this is an organization dominated by people that are not really anti-imperialist and have ties to big foundations and have their own agenda. But DSA is the place to meet people. I actually have drawn the parallel between Students for a Democratic Society in the 1960s and DSA, because Students for a Democratic Society was AstroTurk when it started. The United Auto Workers Union, UAW, they set up this youth group, this youth activist group that would, support the civil rights movement, basically. They had a no communists clause as well. No one who was a communist could join. But they had a lot of funding, and the idea was we'd rather have young people joining this than joining a communist group. But pretty soon, communists started joining DSA. Or SDS, I should say, and pretty soon they started joining it, and by the late 60s, SDS was divided among different communist factions that dominated it, and it was doing some of the most cutting-edge, amazing anti-imperialist and anti-racist work, supporting the Black Panthers, opposing the Vietnam War. So sometimes groups can be started for one reason and take on a different character. And that's what's a little bit dangerous. There's some people that want to look at my work on the synthetic left and they want to just say, aha, see, it's all a conspiracy, screw it. And it's like that's taking things a little bit too far. It's never that simple. There's nuance in the world. And that there are fights among the ruling class. And those fights among the ruling class create openings for the people. But we have to be real about what's going on, right? We have to recognize what's actually taking place, that just because it's on the left doesn't make it a glorious uprising of the people. And just because they're on the right doesn't mean everyone associated with them is pure scum and should just, get endless condemnation, that there are divisions in the ruling class. And how do we as people that actually want to move towards socialism maneuver within all of that to get something good done.
Yeah, so a big topic you mentioned is like the anti-imperialism, and it seems for so much of the American left, if you say favorable things about the USSR or modern-day China or Cuba or whoever else is the target of imperialism, you're called a tanky, I guess. You dealt with this. You had a debate with Valsh about tanky. How do you deal with that slur towards most people?
Well, it's interesting because I think most people don't even know what it means. I mean, it's a very obscure term. I first heard it, and when I first heard it, it was in the history of the British Communist Party. And I guess in the 70s and 80s in the British Communist Party, you had two factions. One that were called the Euros, and those were British communists who were denouncing the Soviet Union. They were Euro communists. They were aligned with like the French Communist Party, the Spanish Communist Party that were like opposing the Soviet Union. Those who didn't and actually defended the Soviet Union's military interventions were called tankies. And the reason that they were calling them tankies is because the way Western media, really in the 70s and 80s and since then, portrayed Soviet military interventions was they wouldn't film Soviet soldiers. They definitely wouldn't film people in the countries who supported those interventions. They would film these cold, mechanical, scary-looking tanks, right? And that's how Soviet military interventions were portrayed. Meanwhile, anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, anti-Chinese activists were always portrayed as hippies. They were John Lennon, Kumbaya singing artists and freedom intellectuals. And then the culmination of that is the famous photograph of the Tiananmen Square incident, where you have this cold mechanical tank that stands for the evil communist system and this one individual standing there, right? And this is a long process of really, it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who was the brainchild of this. He figured out that the way to defeat communists was to try and co-opt left-wing aesthetics, right? That many people around the world had sympathized with the Vietnamese people as they were, a country of peasants and low-income folks fighting off a mighty empire, with their rifles and hiding in the jungle. And so they framed the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan to try and overthrow the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan the same way. And they did the same kind of thing where they portrayed Osama bin Laden and these wealthy Saudis that were building kind of a mercenary army in Afghanistan to fight against the socialist government and the Soviet Union. They portrayed them as if they were Che Guevara, as if they were the Vietnamese people with rifles and all of that. And in the Eastern Bloc, the dissidents that were being backed by the United States and covertly supported. George Soros, that's how he began. He began covertly, funneling money to things to groups in Czechoslovakia and groups in the Soviet Union that were against the status quo. Again, portraying them as if they were free thinkers and intellectuals, and then portraying the Soviet system and the Chinese system as if they were just cold mechanical tanks, and then crushing the glorious individual. It was about the struggle for individualism. And that really has become the mantra of Western society. Western society glorifies individualism above all else. You're not part of a group. You don't have a group identity. You're not part of a class. You're not part of a nation. You are you. And you have a Facebook and you have a Twitter and you can be you. And the West gives you the ability to just fulfill your individuality and be an individual. And that's how Western capitalism began selling itself.
So, I mean, obviously, for you and for many of our listeners who are more conversant with the history of some of these revolutions around the world, there's a tension, and I'm kind of wonder where you fall in terms of like there are real issues facing us today. Our contemporary American society has many challenges to which we think the solution might be, Marxist perhaps or communist. But the energy you put into sort of saying, oh, yeah, Soviet Union, sure, whatever you believe about that, don't really care. Let's talk about the factories and the workers here versus trying to correct that historical record. Where do you kind of fall on that?
Well, I mean, the thing is, at one point in my political development, I was, almost a little bit too over-enthusiastic about defending the USSR. But that was a reaction because I grew up hearing nonstop, socialism has never worked anywhere. It's never accomplished anything. All it's brought is death and failure. You hear that everywhere you go in the United States. Communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And so when I discovered at a very young age, through like reading encyclopedia articles and such, that was false and that the Soviet Union had industrialized a whole country, wiped out illiteracy, been the first country in outer space, defeated the Nazis, had so many record achievements, that the reality and its contradiction with what I'd been told made me almost go a little bit too far. I think that, we need to recognize that the Soviet Union did amazing things. And the fact that it comes up in every argument with Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie Sanders doesn't support the Soviet Union, but yet every time he says we need free healthcare, somebody chimes in and says, well, look what happened in the Soviet Union. We can't do that. We have to fight this historical battle. On the one hand, we need to be clear. Communism has been largely successful. It was communism that made China what it is today, the second largest economy in the world. Millions raised out of poverty. I mean, you can go down the line. I mean, I've talked about, you can list the great things that were built by socialism. I mean, the world's biggest irrigation system was built by socialism in Libya under Gaddafi. The biggest power plant in the Middle East is the Aswan Dam, built by Abdel Nasser, the Arab socialist leader, in conjunction with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, built the world's first spacecraft. Huge achievements have been made, and that's obscured in U.S. society. So we have to defend it on that ground. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that the Soviet model is not returning, right? That the Soviet Union had its achievements up to a point, right? But once you get to the point of full industrialization, full literacy, you get to a certain point, then there was a stagnation. And China had similar issues, and Cuba has had similar issues. Other countries that are building socialism, you do on some level need to unleash people's creativity. You need people to invent things and have new ideas, right? You need to have some kind of market sector, some room for individual initiative within a socialist society. And I think that because I was so pumped up at refuting the widespread lies about the history of the USSR, I kind of overlooked the fact that despite all their achievements, it couldn't continue. They needed to make adjustments. And China has made those kind of adjustments. And they're still adjusting. They're adjusting the way things are now as well. The same for Vietnam. And North Korea would very much like to adopt more market mechanisms. And that, I don't think the government should run hotels. I don't think the government should run restaurants. I'd prefer those things to be worker cooperatives so that every worker gets a share of the profits. No one's exploiting anyone else's labor. And on top of that, I think with worker cooperatives, there's more of an incentive. If you're a wage worker, you clock in, you clock out. But if you get a share of the profits, you're going to work harder, right? And that's why the collective farms of the USSR were actually very effective, because all the workers got a share of how much they produced, right? So I'm not exactly saying that we should blindly defend the way the Soviet Union did things, but I'm saying that they did have huge achievements, and that there's layers to this, right? Once we can get past the lie that socialism didn't accomplish anything, that socialism has indeed had huge successes, then we can start to, once we've acknowledged that, start to talk about how to improve socialism as a political system.
So a lot of the left has been talking about China recently because of the going Cold War against China. And been calling them fascist and state capitalist and a number of other names. But you take a different approach. What is your thoughts on China? Do you view them as socialist still, or what is your take on China today?
Oh, I'd say China is definitely a socialist society. And I really would encourage people. I'm going to be publishing my own edition of Frederick Engels' book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. That is one. Oh, go on. You're going to say something?
No, it's just absolutely my favorite work of Marxism by far, and most readable.
It's one of the most important books in the history of the Marxist movement. And in that book, he explains what socialism is and what it's not, right? And in the final chapters of that book, he talks about the difference between socialism and capitalism is production upon a predetermined plan and eliminating the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production, and having production that is organized for the good of society. And the point is to raise productive forces so much that human beings are no longer slaves to nature. The idea is that human beings can be finally free because of vast material abundance. And that the problem with capitalism is that it creates a contradiction, where under capitalism, for the first time in human history, people were homeless because there wasn't enough, because there were too many houses. In old systems, people were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. In capitalism, people become homeless because there are too many houses, right? We saw that during the financial crisis. There were so many houses up for sale on the market, right? I mean, and all these Americans were losing their jobs and homes because there were too many houses. Under capitalism, people are hungry, not because there's not enough food, but because there's too much food, right? And that the more efficient technology becomes under capitalism, the poorer people get. And we're seeing that right now. Why are there no good jobs for young people? Because technology is advanced, right? We're so good at making stuff that we don't need workers on the assembly line to do it. And so people don't have a place to sell their labor power. And that this is the problem, is that capitalism leads to a situation where abundance creates poverty. People are poor because there is too much, right? And that is deeply irrational. And China, on the other hand, they have a lot of market mechanisms, but they control the means of production. The government, the Communist Party, controls the major industries, controls the lending of money, orders private corporations around all the time, and tells them what to do and forces them to work in the interest of the state central plan. They have a 5-year economic plan. And yes, there's a lot of corruption there. And yes, there are problems with human rights. And I don't want to gloss over any of their problems, but they're not a capitalist country. I mean, the Communist Party is in command of the economy, not the interests of individual capitalists. There is a state central plan, and that's socialism, right? It's socialism with Chinese characteristics.
So, one thing you've talked about in other venues is socialism with American characteristics. I mean, you don't sort of a priori reject nationalism as a force in the development of a socialist state, or at least the idea that there is a national character that has to be incorporated into your project, right?
Well, the thing is, when it comes to the question of nationalism, Lenin divided the nationalism of the people in the colonized world fighting for their independence and they're asserting their rights as a nation is different than like national chauvinism of people in the first world. My whole life I have heard endlessly, America's the greatest country in the world. America's the greatest country in the world. And if you say, how did you measure this? Like, are you saying we have the best economy? Are you saying that and people just look at you, what? You think America's not the greatest country in the world? You must be brainwashed. You must be communist brainwashed. So, I'm not advocating national chauvinism. I'm not advocating even nationalism per se, because I don't think the United States really fits the definition of a nation. But socialism, everywhere that it is applied in a unique way. Socialism in China was very Chinese. I think if Mao had talked the way he talked, in China, if he had talked that way in Russia in like 1905, they would have kicked him out of the Bolsheviks and he would have been a Narudnik, because he was all about going to the peasantry and organizing liberated territory among the peasants. And, that was the Bolsheviks explicitly rejected that. Why? Well, that wasn't what Russia needed at the time. Right. But he applied it to Chinese conditions. About 40 years before Mao's birth, there was a mass peasant rebellion that shook all of China. The Taiping Uprising. I'm probably pronouncing that horrendously. I don't speak Chinese, but it was a mass peasant uprising. This guy who said that he was Jesus's younger brother had come to Earth to lead the Chinese peasantry to create heaven on earth, this heavenly kingdom, led millions of peasants to rise up against their landlords. Of course, the emperor fought him, and it was this big civil war. That had a huge influence on Mao Zedong, right? And as much as Mao framed everything in terms of Marxism, Leninism, and dialectical materialism, he had studied extensively what went on in this Taiping Uprising and had figured that out to develop what eventually became the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Revolution. And the Bolshevik model, for example, Russia has a long history of secret societies, right? The party of a new type that Lenin developed. In Russia, you got the Decembrists, you got the old believers, revolutionary conspiracies among the elite. There's a whole history of that, right? And that socialism, when it comes to this country, if it's actually going to work here, it's going to require us to understand the conditions of the United States and apply socialism in a way that works here. And it won't come by dogmatically copying a model from another country. It'll be a unique socialism here. And I don't know exactly what works here. I'm not in a position to brag and tell people that I know what works and I have figured out the socialism with American characteristics. I'd like to figure it out, and I'd like to facilitate the conversation to help people figure it out. But we have to figure it out because if we continue to present socialism as a foreign ideology, as something in another country, if we continue to say things like, we're here to destroy America, America's evil. If we continue to talk that way, we're going to fail, and we have been failing. And, right now, I unfortunately, a lot of the left present themselves as a very destructive force, right? And when you're young, I certainly was mad when I was a teenager. I lived in a small town, very religious and conservative, and I didn't like the people, the political attitude I was growing up around, and I was a bit of an edgelord, and we all are in our teen years, right? And that's okay, right? It's part of growing up, right? But socialism in its reality is about construction, and that most people in this country, they might go through a phase of teenage rebellion or whatever, but after that, they want to get a nice job, they want to get married, maybe they want to have kids, they want to have a comfortable life. They don't want their country to be destroyed. They don't want to live in utter chaos. They don't want to die from disease. They don't want instability. They don't want riots in the streets. They want things to go very well. And if the left is simply identified with destruction and tearing things down and chaos and yelling and stuff, that can only go so far. And ultimately, society will start to reject you because, even you talk about Trotsky and Stalin. The reason Trotsky was rejected and Stalin rose is because Trotsky stood for permanent revolution. And, after the Russian Civil War, how many millions of people died in the barricades and in the war and in the fighting between the Red Army and the White Army? And Stalin saying, okay, I want us to, come together as a country and build socialism and build, a planned economy. And Trotsky's saying, oh, no, we just got to keep our eyes on the West and spread communism all over the world. And we're going to draft everybody into the military. Is it a surprise the Russian people went with Stalin and not with Trotsky? It shouldn't be a surprise, right? That this, yes, people get angry. Yes, people want to rebel. Yes, people want to be destructive and tear things down, right? You talk about Sigmund Freud and libido and all of that. That's real, okay? But it only goes so far. And if socialism is only identified with that destructive impulse, it'll never really catch on. And the right wing will be very, very good at pushing it back.
Well, and it's sort of interesting how much time the left in the US these days spends relitigating some odd fights between, like, as the old left was dissolving and the new left was forming or coming to dominance, versus looking a little further back into American history and looking at, like, the long, proud tradition of radical labor, of indigenous American social movements that were incredibly powerful and giant agents for change. Feels like we've just kind of forgotten all that and gone, hey, let's just relitigate like 1950 all over again.
I was an activist in Cleveland for a few years, and I was, profiled in the magazine, in like Cleveland Scene magazine, which is the main alternative paper there, because I was involved with a walkout where some people got beaten up protesting, and it was a long story. You can look into it, but when I was in Cleveland, I will say I got to see an organization that was in the black community in Cleveland that was called Black on Black Crime Incorporated, and it was a black activist group in Cleveland, and those folks were real community organizers. Every Wednesday evening, they had their meeting. There'd be 80 to 90 to 100 people there every week. Whatever was going on in the neighborhood, whether it was a hospital closing or, street light cameras that were, giving people tickets in kind of a predatory way, or whatever it was, they were on top of it. And everybody, the leader of it was a guy named Art McCoy, who owned a barber shop. And this was a black nationalist organization. They welcomed communists and even white communists to participate in their group. I was allowed to go to a few of their meetings. So were people from some of the Maoist groups and such. But it was about fighting for the rights of black people on the east side of Cleveland. And they were real, dedicated community organizers. But they were of a very different character than the organized political left. And seeing the way they organized and how they were at the center of their community, that's what the Communist Party of the 1930s was in cities all over this country. That's what the Black Panthers were in the 1970s. That's the role that they played. That's the role that real communist groups play, is they're in neighborhoods, they're taking care of people, they're organizing people, they're on top of what the concern is. They build these structures, these like resistant structures where people know they can turn to get support. That's what it is. It's not hashtag revolution. And that, again, I was part of Occupy Wall Street. That was like the original hashtag revolution, but I've seen it play out. Hashtag revolution can only go so far, right? When you're not building an actual structure, an actual apparatus, when you're simply kind of going out and feeling pumped up, it only goes so far. And that these kind of structures that people build, Lenin talks about dual power, for example. That's in a lot of Lenin's writings. That's the real power. And communist groups don't seem to really have that much in the United States. I think that there has been a huge effort to beat this back. Let's be real, okay? The United States government is the government that goes all over the world making sure people don't have socialist revolutions. So you think it's going to be easy to build any kind of socialist apparatus in the United States itself? Of course not. It's going to be extremely difficult. But with the way things are going, it's going to have to be done. And I think that the divisions in the ruling class are creating an opening. The fact that DSA has been resurrected, I mean, when I was first an activist, people like DSA was a rumor. It was like an urban legend. It was like, like there's this group that a lot of labor leaders are in. I think it's called DSA. Like their website hadn't been updated in years or something, right? But out of the blue, all of a sudden DSA, and they got Jacobin magazine, and everyone's joining the DSA. Well, that shows that sections of the ruling class have said we need to push back against the alt-right. So we're going to start allowing some of this socialism stuff to happen. But of course, we're going to control it. And we're going to make sure that certain voices that are anti-communist and pro-imperialist and agree with U.S. foreign policy are highlighted. But it shows there's a division, right? And that we need to make the most of this division, right? We need to, those of us who want to get the United States towards socialism need to figure out how we can maneuver within this mess, to actually get something good to come out of this.
Well, yeah, I mean, hashtag revolution can so quickly turn into Revolution Inc., unfortunately, I think, is the danger, perhaps. But it is interesting to say that there's openings there. I sort of wonder whether you're, well, broadly, I mean, the problem is it's easy to sort of talk about this stuff in the abstract. How are you actually feeling about the chance of that right now? I mean, how are your cynicism levels?
Well, it's never fun to get barraged and attacked with all kinds of people, who never know you and never heard of you, don't know anything about you. And they're suddenly, I was informed by somebody. I don't know if you guys watch the YouTube lives. I do at least once a week, every so often. I do a lot of those. I know somebody said that on those lives, I just drone on and on about transgender ideology. And I thought, no, I don't. Like, I've used that phrase a total of one time in response to someone criticizing someone I interviewed who used that phrase, but it's like there's this, like, people don't know anything about me. They see one picture of me with somebody in Russia that they've never heard of, that they've been told is a bad guy. And so he sat next to this bad guy and he interviewed somebody one time who's transphobic. Oh, this guy just goes. I mean, it's frustrating to see people mischaracterizing you and all that. That can be very demoralizing. But I've been through this before. This is not the first time this has happened, actually. And every time you do this, it toughens you up a little bit to prepare for what's coming. And the thing is, good people keep trickling towards me. Every time this happens to me, good people find their way to me, like 5 or 6 people that are really dedicated to what I'm about, that really want to help build, a real socialist movement, that are excited about the Center for Political Innovation, the think tank I'm in the process of launching. I continue to meet good people. And the thing is, I heard about you guys. It's interesting. You guys reached out to me. 2 days later, a longtime friend of mine texted me your website, right? Your podcast, and said, you should really check out these guys. They're great. They're amazing. And I said, wow, these are the guys that reached out to me. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, it happens, right? That the more hate you get, the more play you get, the more you meet people who really are in it for real, right? And I get a lot of flack, for example, for defending Minister Louis Farrakhan, right? I don't agree with Minister Louis Farrakhan. All the stuff he says about Jews, all the stuff he says about LGBT people, count me out. That's not my cup of tea. But I have seen the work that Minister Louis Farrakhan has done in the black community. I've seen the role he played in building a huge mass movement to oppose the bombing of Libya. Again, having gone to police brutality demonstrations long before it was cool and seeing the Nation of Islam always being there, I respect the Nation of Islam as an important group in the black community. But people who just, isn't Farrakhan this guy who said this about? It's like they don't. It takes doing real work. It takes really, getting things done to really understand the importance there. And, people who have done that kind of work and people who do understand what's really going on, not just domestically, but in the world, see me saying, hey, just because Farrakhan has said these bad things, we have to recognize his important role. And something goes off in their head and they say, Caleb gets me. Caleb understands this. You know what I'm saying? And that, yes, teenagers who play lots of video games and, are making videos about their ideal utopia and how it's better than somebody else's ideal utopia, they're not going to get me, and that's fine. But I don't think they're going to accomplish that much in the real world. The people that want to accomplish things in the real world are going to continue to find their way toward me, and that's good.
But it's interesting that it's such a lost value and feels like a recently lost value on the political left, however broadly construed, is to take people not as a sort of a caricature of themselves or as just sort of a proxy for the worst thing they've ever said, and actually say, no, you can kind of pick and choose, and you can build these alliances that are based on agreement on a single issue. Maybe it's a single, anti-imperialist campaign or something. But that is not. I mean, as you said, you were sitting down with the original Nazbol, I believe, right? I mean, that's not a popular position on the political left these days, for us at least.
What is a Nazbol? I mean, there is a political party in the 19th.
It's us, apparently.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Apparently,
you had me on here.
We get called it, yeah.
And you had me on here, so you're definitely Nazbols now.
Exactly.
I mean, I got Nazbol infected in Russia, and then you got infected via me.
Yeah.
And everyone listening right now is a Nazbol because you listened to me, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's silly. There was a political party in Russia in the 1990s called the National Bolshevik Party. Okay. And it was, I guess, the understanding was that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party won a lot of electoral victories, but there was a lot of election fraud. They didn't defeat Boris Yeltsin. There were some people in the Russian Communist Party that felt like they needed to build a party that was a little more fanatical. But they also wanted to appeal to some Russian nationalism and things like that. So they formed this National Bolshevik Party. And it got a little out of control, from what I understand. There was some bigotry and some, bad things that went on. It was outlawed and it's illegal and it's no longer exists. Now, there's a thinker who was involved with the founding of the Russian Communist Party after the fall of the Soviet Union and was involved in the National Bolshevik Party, who now runs the Eurasian movement in Russia. His name's Alexander Dugin. His views are not mine. He is a conservative. He is a traditionalist, but he's an anti-imperialist. And I find him to be very interesting. And I read his book, The Fourth Political Theory, and having recently been to, at the time that I met with him, having recently been to Venezuela, having recently been to Iran, having recently been to Ecuador, and a lot of places, he kind of captured the feelings of people around the world who don't, support Western capitalism and imperialism, but aren't explicitly communists. It was the Iranians recommended I read Dugin, the Venezuelans recommended I read Dugin, and that his book, The Fourth Political Theory, kind of gives voice to how people in the developing world who don't like, American capitalism, but are not ideological communists, how they feel, right? And it's a rejection of elements of the left here as well as elements of the right? Rejecting the free market stuff on the right, also rejecting, the consumer culture and some of the social liberalism here as well. And that he doesn't even really name the fourth, he doesn't really say what it is. He just kind of describes it. And he says that it's happening. If you read the book, he says around the world, we're seeing the rise of something he calls the fourth political theory. And it's this strange new anti-imperialism that he's describing. And he does a very good job of describing it as a political scientist. It's a good book. I don't agree with a lot of the contents in it because he rejects the notion of historical progress. I'm a Marxist. He's not. But it's like, again, he's very critical of fascism in that book. He talks about fascism as a supremacist ideology, as an ideology that says one race is superior to another race, that calls for war, that calls for nations to be antagonistic to each other. He sees his fourth political theory as something beyond both communism, fascism, and Western liberalism. It's very Russian. Right, there's a lot of conversations like this in Russia. In Russia right now, there's a big struggle to figure out how they're different from the West. America is so antagonistic to Russia right now, right? And they have this whole history of the Soviet Union, but there's also a lot of conservatism in Russia. And there's kind of an identity struggle in the Russian mind. How are we different from the West? What is it that makes us different? What about the West do we not like? What about the West do we like? That's a whole conversation that's going on. He's a voice in that conversation. He's a Russian political theorist who feels that way. And it's similar to what's going on in China right now. During the Mao era, Confucius, the classic thinker of Chinese civilization, he was hated. They had a whole campaign to destroy his writings and all of that. Well, now they found kind of common ground between Confucius and Mao. And the Chinese Communist Party even argues sometimes that Confucius was the first communist. And they point to some of his statements about building an ideal world, a world where everyone has what they need and there's and that they kind of fit Marxism in with Confucianism and with the traditions of Chinese civilization, while at the same time rejecting all aspects of Confucianism that are part of feudalism, which I think is fascinating because people look at Confucianism and they say, oh, it's just feudal tradition. Well, there's more to it than that. But again, they're trying to figure this out. I'm not sure they have a clear 100% answer about this, just like we're doing over here, right? We're trying to figure out what does it mean to be left in this time, right? Everyone's trying to figure out the right answer. And in order to do that, you have to be able to ask questions. And if you create an atmosphere where you can't ask questions, you can't talk with people who've been canceled, who have said something bad, or it's just quite silly. And but I mean, as far as Nazbol, there is no such thing really as a Nazbol. That party doesn't exist anymore, and all of that. But I think that the people on the internet, a lot of them have kind of redefined it to mean someone who sounds like a communist but is actually a Nazi. Well, I'm not a Nazi, and Nazis hate me. I've debated Nazis on many occasions, and argued against their ideas, and those folks really have no love for me or my family members or whatnot. So, it is what it is. But, and again, what's the problem with this, right? On the left, it's not like, how about you disagree with me? You disagree with me, right? I mean, I disagree with you, you disagree with me, whatever. But it's like, if I disagree with you, you're a Nazi. That is such a toxic way of arguing. And people used to criticize the old Communist Party USA for this, right? I mean, they had this theory of social fascism, right, where they said that people, if they're not in the Communist Party, if they're Trotskyists or socialists or whatever, they're social fascists. Well, many people felt in the Communist Party that policy really isolated the Communist Party, made the Communist Party unable to form alliances. And by the mid-1930s, when they were building a popular front against actual fascism, they really stopped talking that way. So maybe we should learn the lesson of the 1930s and not be going after people in our own camp so much. And maybe we should talk about actual political differences, not hyperbolic allegations.
So one of my favorite videos of yours is a really short video, which I think is called something like a 6-minute introduction to dialectical materialism. And I highly recommend anybody check it out. It's very crisp. But there's you add in one little barb at the end, or just one little surprise where you mention you're not really a strict materialist, you say, because you are also religious. I just want to ask you a little bit about that and how that sort of integrates into your life, and what does that mean to you?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in a very, very small town. I was kind of basically forced to go to church every Sunday against my will. My family, we were mainline Protestants, whereas most people in my town were evangelicals and fundamentalists. And I mean, a number of the science teachers at my high school taught us that we had two choices: biblical creationism or evolution, and it was very much a fundamentalist right-wing atmosphere. And I really hated that, right? So when Richard Dawkins and all of them came along, and it was time, at that point I was a new atheist. I was all about it, But then, I moved from Ohio to New York, and I lived in New York, which is very much a secular culture. If you say anything about religion, people look at you strangely. Like, I remember at the time I was an atheist getting up and giving speeches where I'd say, they say the United States is a land of milk and honey. And because that's a biblical allusion, like there are 3 people in the audience would like cringe. Like I just sworn or like been crass with them or something. And it's like religion is just such a taboo here when it's such a big part of millions and millions of working people's lives. And then, make it more complicated. I went to Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I immediately all the people talked like the people in my small town. We'd be talking about something politically, and they'd be saying, well, that's just like Moses, or that's just like, and I was like, wow, okay, that sounds familiar. But then I went to Venezuela, and in Venezuela, I visited the colectivos. Most of the colectivos in Venezuela are Christian, right? They're Roman Catholic Christian socialists, right? I mean, they view Jesus Christ. I mean, Hugo Chavez said Jesus Christ was the first communist, and that made me kind of reconsider things and think about, who am I? And again, it's just like you never want to get forced into a duality, right? And when I was living in my town, it was like I got forced into a duality. Either you believe in God and accept all these evangelicals, or you become a hard atheist, right? And I realized that I had been kind of forced into a duality because I really am a moral person. I do believe in right and wrong. You know what I mean? I am motivated by something higher than my own self-interest, right? But at the same time, I'm certainly not an evangelical. I'm certainly not a creationist or anything like that. I don't think the Bible is literally 100% true, whatever. But, the spirituality that I grew up with is very much a big part of what influenced me to become a communist in the first place, was a set of moral understandings and all of that. And that the church does play a very positive role in many people's lives. And that it was time for me to re-examine kind of who I was, right, and what role I was playing. And that's what made me discover that, the Bible and Christianity and the story of Jesus Christ and his life is very, very important to me. So, and I guess in that sense, I'm not a hard materialist then. I am a religious person. I'm not a member of any church currently. My wife is Roman Catholic. She only attends when her mother's in town. Don't tell her that. But don't tell her I said that. I'm sure she's not proud of that. But, Christianity, religion is a very, it was a very big influence on me growing up. And it's something that, that kind of pointed me toward becoming who I am today. And also, let me say this, I even when I was an atheist, it disturbed me to see that so many atheists were the Ayn Rand types, and I mean, I'll be real about this, that's a big trend among, they talk about new atheism. The reason it's new atheism is because the old atheism, the word atheist comes out of the French Revolution, right? And it was associated with the left, with communism and all of that. The new atheist movement is of a very different character. And economic libertarianism, I mean that stuff. I abhor libertarianism, right? And the reason I abhor it is because it is in opposition to my moral code. The virtue of selfishness, right? The idea that might makes right, that we shouldn't have compassion, that altruism and kindness are weaknesses, that are flaws in the human character. That stuff is evil. I mean, in my view. And I don't know. I mean, that stuff is satanic. I mean, I don't know what other words to describe it. And that, the fact that is so popular among the libertarian crowd is very disturbing to me. I think at one point Ayn Rand referred to Christianity as, quote, the guilt-peddling Jesus industry, if I'm not mistaken. Right? And it's like her critique of religion was that religion made people care about other people, made people be nice, and it's like,
she wasn't a big fan of that, was she?
yeah, and that made me kind of reconsider all of this. So and then on top of that, the dialectical materialist philosophy, it's largely correct, I would say, but at the same time, there's something to be said, like you all have been pointing out, for unity, for coming together, for working with people with whom you disagree. And this notion that change always comes through clash and confrontation, and we just need to escalate the confrontation. We need to just destroy more and confront more and fight. And it's just going to be that's a little bit overwhelming. And that's kind of, I almost wonder if some of the toxicity we see in left-wing circles could be rooted in kind of an overemphasis of that dialectical view, that if you just call out people enough, if you just emphasize your differences, if you clash and clash and clash, somehow good is going to come out of that. I think sometimes you need to, be seeking harmony rather than seeking to extrapolate contradiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think it's, as evidenced by your presence on a podcast called Twink Revolution. I mean, there's some leftover antagonisms, I guess, in the LGBT community that are sort of harkening back to maybe the Bush era. And yet there's people who are sort of really excited to relitigate those. And I think if you're trying to act in service of some sort of left politics, you're going to have to grapple with the fact that religion is a large force in many people's lives. It's kind of the only thing that cuts through alienation for many people in modern American society. And like it's a thing you just got to deal with. And yet there's people who would really rather have a rather childish view of that and be like, man, it's dumb and bad and they hate the gays.
Well, it's interesting because, the founder of Ba'athist Arab socialism was Michel Aflaq. And he grew up in a Christian family in Syria. He became a communist atheist. But then, he realized that Islam was so important to the Arab people and the Arab spirit that he realized that even though he did not, I think he remained an atheist. He realized, though, that because of that Islam was going to have an important role in the Arab socialism that developed, and that the idea of building a socialism in the Arab world that didn't have Islam in it was pretty silly. And I think you could say a similar thing about Christianity in the United States. Now, increasingly, there are other religious groups. There's a much more secular section of the population. But to say that Christianity won't have a big stamp and influence on the socialism that develops here is a little bit naive. It will, no doubt about it.
Right. I mean, I'm personally an atheist, but I would much rather have an American socialism if it had to be sold to people in terms of great quotes from Jesus and wonderful humanistic principles that people have pulled out of the Bible and applied in that way. I mean, that's great. But there's a segment of people who I think it's maybe back to the people who really get the joy out of destruction and being kind of edgy would reject that outright, I think.
Sure. Indeed.
So you spent time in Iran, and it seems like the neocons in Washington are super eager to start a new war there. I'm really curious to know what your experience was like in Iran and how it kind of the realities versus what we're told in the U.S. media.
Well, every time I went to Iran, I've been to Iran a total of 4 times. Every time I went there, I had thought I understood it the previous time, and I learned that I was completely wrong the next time I went there. It was like one thing that I often will tell people is that everything that Americans think about Iran is actually true about Saudi Arabia, right? Women in Iran, they drive cars, they vote, they're generals in the military. There's more women in the Iranian parliament than in the U.S. Legislature. I saw posters in Iran of women with AK-47 rifles in their, headscarves, with their guns. Iran is not, to present Iran, as if it is this primitive feudal society. I mean, there's problems, no doubt, and there are issues with human rights, no doubt. And I'm not going to gloss over the problems that they have. But like one of the misconceptions, I remember when I was in college, the LGBT organization on my campus put up this poster, and it had two men hanging, and it said, Ahmadinejad says there's no homosexuals in Iran. That's because he killed them all. Well, the two men in that picture were not hanged for being gay. They were hanged for raping a 13-year-old boy at knife point. Now, I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but I think executing someone for rape of a minor is a little bit different than executing someone for simply being homosexual. And that, there's a gay neighborhood in Tehran currently. And there's just an understanding that the police stay out of there, and that's where you can be gay in Tehran now. It is officially illegal to be gay in Iran. Now, the way this was explained to me, there's a New York Times article that confirmed this as well. They told this to me, and I actually read it in the New York Times. In Iran, right, in theory, according to their law, you can get the death penalty for renouncing the faith, for leaving Islam, for cheating, for adultery, or for homosexual acts. But there have to be 4 witnesses who were in the room, right? And they have to have actually seen something go into something else, right? It can't be that they just assume that's what you did. And then they are confessing to a crime because they didn't try to stop you, right? They have to explain why they didn't try to stop you. So no person in Iran has ever actually gotten the death penalty for engaging in a homosexual act because they never are they able to produce 4 witnesses to see something go into something else. And no one's in Iran's ever gotten the death penalty for adultery for the same kind of thing, right? That it's a crime that is basically, it's almost symbolic. It's on the books to make a religious statement. There is, I understand, a lesser charge in Iran that they use in some areas where it's like if you make a pass at another man in a public place, that's considered like public indecency or something like that, and they can use that, and that's punished with like a fine or something like that, and that's not good. I'm not for that, but Iran is certainly not the hateful society it was portrayed as. I visited a synagogue in Iran, for example, right? I went to church on Sunday morning to the Armenian Christian church in Iran, and they had a big fence around it. And I thought, geez, Christians in Iran are treated way better than Muslims in America are treated, I saw a lot of things in Iran that just didn't really fit the narrative we have of Iranian society. I mean, Iran has problems, no doubt. And there are big divisions in Iran right now. There's a reformist movement that really wants to get closer to the United States and be more free market. There's a hardliner movement that wants to revive the anti-capitalist goals of the revolution, but also the more religious and hardline sides of it. There's Marxism has a big influence in Iran. That surprised me too. I was told before I went that all the communists in Iran were all killed, and you wouldn't know how many people I met in Iran who told me, yeah, I was in the Communist Party when I was young. They have big Marx in their house. They have the complete works of Karl Marx. There are people that are on Iranian television who have a Marxist perspective and give a Marxist analysis of world events. They just begin every show with, in the name of God, the most merciful. And they're not a member of any organized communist party because that would be illegal. But, it's way more complicated than you think, right? And that, Ahmadinejad, his wing of Iranian politics is very much seen as kind of continuing the wing of the Islamic Revolution that was friendlier to Marxism. He set up something called the House of Latin America, a building that facilitates Iran's relations with Venezuela and with Cuba. And for example, right now, there are now whole supermarkets owned by Iran in Venezuela that were just recently set up, right? And, I saw posters of Malcolm X all over Iran. I saw posters of Che Guevara and Hugo Chavez all over Iran. And, it's complicated. These things are never as simple as you would think they are. Let me just put it that way. And that there are many different views. Unfortunately, there's a lot of religious bigotry in Iran, I would say. I heard a lot of things about Jews that I wish I hadn't heard, But Israel is their main enemy, and that's kind of how things are framed to them. They see Israel as the representative of Jews and themselves as the representative of Persians, and a lot of them see this as an eternal, long-standing ethnic fight. Well, I was there to say, well, I don't see it that way, and that I don't think ethnic bigotry is a good thing. But then I realized that in the developing world, ethnic bigotry is a reality in a lot of places. A lot of people from South America will say things about other ethnic groups in South America that sound really awful. And, you go to Africa and tribal differences, and that in the West, we since the 70s, really, since the 60s and 70s, we've kind of had this understanding you don't talk about someone's race, you don't talk about someone's ethnic group. A lot of the developing world has not come to that consensus yet, right? That racism, like some of these mystical traditional beliefs, is something that kind of goes away as you modernize and as you industrialize. And unfortunately, there's a lot of developing countries that haven't really overcome that. So it's difficult.
I feel like I could spend a lot of time just asking you about your travels, but I think we're kind of at time. I did want to ask you a little bit about the think tank you're developing. You said it's called the Center for Political Innovation. Is there something people should be looking out for? Or ways people can contribute?
We have a website. It's kind of a bare bones website at the moment, cpi-usa.org. We're reworking it, though. Within the next few weeks, it'll be much, much better done. We're going to have a public event in Los Angeles this November, most likely. Fingers crossed, if the pandemic doesn't ruin it. So, and I'll be on the West Coast, so it'll be great to see you guys. You're out on the West Coast, if I'm not mistaken.
We'll be there.
Right?
We're in San Francisco, yeah.
Awesome. Great. So we're looking to have an event on the West Coast in November, and then our official kickoff event. It was supposed to be this April, but then the pandemic happened. It'll probably be next April on the East Coast. We'll officially kick off as an organization and launch with a 2-day mini conference at a hotel here in New York City. That's where we're at. We did publish our first book, which is available on Amazon.com, which is our own edition of Gaddafi's Green Book, The Green Book by Muammar Gaddafi, with an introduction by myself. The next book we're going to publish will be Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. And we're going to try to publish some of the classic works of socialism with modern introductions that are kind of up to date. And one thing, this is just throwing this out there, Amazon.com, if you order like a classic book from them, prepare to be disappointed. I ordered The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. It came in the mail, and it was the size of an atlas, right? And then it had a table of contents with page numbers, but none of the pages had any page numbers on them. There's been articles about this, that because these books are not copyrighted, they don't want to pay an actual publisher to publish their edition. So they just kind of pay, a techie kid to cut and paste the book, right? And so, people order Marxist books and they get, awful. I ordered Gramsci's prison notebooks, no page numbers, right? Very frustrating. So the understanding is we'll be putting out our own editions as the Center for Political Innovation of the Marxist classics. They'll have page numbers. They'll have nice introductions. They won't be the size of an atlas. And you'll be getting a good edition of the book that you can get on Amazon. You'll be able to trust our brand as being good. We're also going to publish some new stuff. I'm working on a book on the concept of the synthetic left. It's almost finished. I wrote a book called The City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, which kind of lays out the project and the vision behind the Center for Political Innovation. So that's kind of where we're at. So check us out. I'm available at CalebMaupin.com, CalebMaupin.com. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, etc., YouTube, lots of videos, lots of lives. Tune in, join the conversation.
Thank you so much, Caleb. We'll drop those links in the bio. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.